Step through a doorway in time, 300 million years into the past, and you'd find yourself standing at the edge of a world that looks like Earth, but feels like a fever dream, where trees aren't trees but towering scale-covered giants that shoot skyward without branches, where dragonflies the size of seagulls patrol airways thick enough to taste, where millipedes longer than your body crush through leaf litter with the weight of armoured tanks, where the very atmosphere hums with a chemical intensity that would set your neurons on fire. This is the Carboniferous period, when evolution cranked oxygen levels so high that the planet became a pressurized chamber of biological extremes, and every rule of survival you understand would become lethally obsolete within hours. The forests aren't sanctuaries, they're suffocating vertical mazes of decay and danger. The air isn't life-giving, it's a slow-acting poison. The insects aren't harmless. They're apex predators with compound eyes tracking your every movement. Welcome to the world that built the coal you burn today. The world that sculpted modern insects into their current miniature forms. The world that would kill you faster than almost any other period in Earth's violent history. You wouldn't last 24 hours. Not because you're unprepared, but because the Carboniferous was never meant for creatures like you. This is the scientific breakdown of why those ancient forests would become your grave, told through the specific atmospheric chemistry, predatory arthropods, environmental catastrophes, and evolutionary nightmares that made this period one of the most spectacular and hostile chapters in the story of life on Earth. The hyperoxic nightmare. Your first breath in the Carboniferous atmosphere would feel like inhaling pure electricity. The air around you contains 35% oxygen, a concentration so far above modern levels that your entire respiratory system would immediately enter crisis mode. This isn't a subtle difference. This is 14 percentage points of additional oxygen molecules flooding into your lungs with every inhalation, overwhelming biochemical processes that evolved specifically for the 21% concentration you've breathed your entire life. The initial sensation would be intoxicating in the most literal sense. Oxygen toxicity begins with euphoria, a rush of mental clarity, heightened sensory perception, and physical energy that feels almost supernatural. Your brain, suddenly receiving far more oxygen than it needs, would fire synapses faster than normal. Colors would appear more vivid. Sounds would sharpen. You might feel invincible. This phase lasts maybe 30 minutes before your body's regulatory system starts screaming warnings that something is catastrophically wrong. The problem lies in the chemistry of oxygen itself. At normal concentrations, oxygen is essential for cellular respiration, the process that generates energy in your cells. But oxygen is also highly reactive. When concentrations rise too high, oxygen molecules begin forming free radicals, unstable compounds that steal electrons from your cellular structures. These free radicals attack everything: your cell membranes, your DNA, your proteins. It's called oxidative stress, and in a hyperoxic environment like the Carboniferous, it would accelerate at terrifying speed. Within the first 2 hours, the symptoms would become impossible to ignore. Your vision would start degrading as your retinas suffered damage from the oxygen surplus. Peripheral vision would narrow, creating a tunnel vision effect. Headaches would intensify, deep, throbbing pain as blood vessels in your brain constricted in response to the chemical imbalance. Your fingers and toes would tingle, then go numb, as your peripheral nervous system began malfunctioning. Nausea would set in as your digestive system, never designed for these conditions, started shutting down non-essential functions. But the real catastrophe would be happening in your lungs themselves. The delicate alveoli, tiny air sacs where oxygen transfers into your bloodstream, would begin suffering chemical burns from the hyperoxic exposure. Fluid would start accumulating in your lungs, a condition called pulmonary edema. Each breath would become harder, wetter, more labored. You'd start coughing, trying to clear airways that were filled with your own bodily fluids. The irony would be brutal. Surrounded by more oxygen than any human has ever breathed, you'd be slowly drowning in your own lungs. Studies of modern oxygen toxicity in hyperbaric medicine provide the roadmap for what would happen next. After 4 to 6 hours of exposure to oxygen concentrations above 30%, seizures become likely. Your neurons, overstimulated and damaged by free radicals, would begin firing chaotically. You might experience convulsions, loss of consciousness, or respiratory arrest. The medical term is CNS, oxygen toxicity, central nervous system poisoning by the very element you need to survive. Even if you somehow avoided the most severe neurological effects, the long-term exposure would be fatal. Your lungs would continue deteriorating, filling with more fluid, reducing oxygen transfer even as you gasped in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. The oxidative damage to your cells would accelerate, breaking down tissues faster than your body could repair them. Within 12 to 15 hours, you'd be in respiratory failure, your body shutting down not from lack of oxygen, but from too much of it. The Carboniferous organisms survived this atmosphere because they evolved specifically for it. Insects developed tracheal systems, direct tubes delivering oxygen to tissues, that thrived in high oxygen conditions and enabled their gigantism. Early tetrapods had different lung structures and metabolic rates. They were built for this world. You are not. Your respiratory system, your circulatory system, your nervous system. Everything about your biology is calibrated for modern atmospheric conditions. In the Carboniferous, that calibration would kill you. This is the first and most inescapable danger of the Carboniferous forests. The air itself is poison. You couldn't filter it, couldn't avoid it, couldn't adapt to it. Every breath would be damaging you at the molecular level. The forest wouldn't need to hunt you. The atmosphere would do the killing all on its own. Meganeura, the aerial executioner. While your body slowly succumbs to oxygen poisoning, you'd face another immediate threat from above, one that would exploit your disorientation and physical deterioration with the precision of an evolved hunter. Meganeura, the giant griffinfly of the Carboniferous, was not a dragonfly in the modern sense. It was something far more dangerous, an aerial predator with a wingspan reaching 75 centimeters, compound eyes containing thousands of individual lenses, and mandibles powerful enough to crush through the exoskeletons of other large arthropods. This was no delicate insect. This was a flying apex predator that ruled the Carboniferous airways with speed, aggression, and hunting strategies that have no modern equivalent. The fossil evidence tells us exactly how Meganeura was built for killing. Its wings show structures optimized for both speed and maneuverability, corrugated patterns that provided strength without weight, venation networks that allowed precise control during flight. Biomechanical studies reconstructing Meganeura flight capabilities suggest it could reach speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour in straight flight, with turning abilities that would shame most modern birds. Those wings weren't just for cruising, they were weapons of pursuit. Its head was dominated by enormous compound eyes, each eye composed of approximately 30,000 individual facets called ommatidia. This visual system gave Meganeura nearly 360-degree vision with incredible motion detection. It could track multiple moving objects simultaneously, calculate distances with precision, and identify prey from significant distances. In the dim, filtered light beneath the Carboniferous canopy, those eyes would still function with devastating efficiency. You wouldn't see Meganeura coming until it was already on you. The mandibles were perhaps the most terrifying feature. Unlike modern dragonflies, which grab prey with their legs and consume it in flight, Meganeura had jaw structures powerful enough to bite through chitin and flesh with minimal effort. Fossil analyses of related giant arthropods show mandible stress patterns indicating forces capable of crushing hard-shelled prey. These weren't delicate mouthparts for sipping fluids. These were bone-breaking weapons designed for aggressive predation. How Meganeura actually hunted remains partially speculative, but the physics and biology provide clear constraints. Its large size required constant feeding to maintain its metabolic rate. Studies of modern large dragonflies suggest Meganeura would need to consume significant prey daily, probably hunting continuously during daylight hours. It likely employed ambush tactics, perching on vegetation and launching at passing prey, or aerial patrols, where it cruised through forest clearings, waiting for movement below. You would present an unusual target, too large to be normal prey, but moving erratically due to oxygen toxicity symptoms. Your impaired vision and slowed reflexes would make you vulnerable. The first attack would come from your blind spot, announced only by the buzz of wings moving at high frequency. Meganeura's strategy would be swift, a diving approach from above or behind, mandibles extending forward, aiming for exposed flesh on your neck, arms, or face. The bite itself would be catastrophic. Those mandibles, designed to pierce arthropod armor, would tear through human skin and muscle easily. The injury wouldn't be surgical. It would be ragged, destructive, designed to incapacitate. Even if you drove off the first attacker, the wound would bleed heavily. In a pre-antibiotic world filled with bacteria and fungi thriving in the humid Carboniferous environment, infection would be inevitable. But here's the truly terrifying part. Meganeura wouldn't be alone. Fossil deposits from Carboniferous sites show that these giant arthropods were relatively common in their ecosystems. Where there's one, there will be others. The scent of blood, the sound of struggle, the vibrations of movement, all of these would attract additional hunters. Modern dragonflies are territorial, but they're also opportunistic. A wounded, slow-moving target would draw them like sharks to chum. Multiple Meganeura attacking simultaneously would be unsurvivable. You couldn't fight them off. They'd approach from different angles, too fast to track. You couldn't outrun them, not with vision blurring from oxygen toxicity and lungs filling with fluid. You couldn't hide effectively in the dense vegetation. Their visual systems would detect movement through the foliage. Each subsequent bite would weaken you further, creating a feedback loop of blood loss, exhaustion, and panic. The fossil record preserves evidence of Meganeura feeding behavior through microscopic analysis of damage patterns on other arthropod fossils. Bite marks show they targeted joints and soft tissue areas, suggesting sophisticated prey selection. They weren't mindless. They were calculating hunters that identified vulnerabilities and exploited them. Against a human, those vulnerabilities would be everywhere. Thin skin, exposed face, vulnerable neck. Within hours of entering the Carboniferous forests, you'd become prey to an ecosystem where insects were the monsters and size offered no protection. Arthropleura, the armored trampler. As Meganeura hunted from above, an even more disturbing threat would be approaching through the leaf litter at your feet. A sound like grinding machinery, a rhythmic rustling of hundreds of legs moving in coordinated waves, and then the appearance of something that would redefine your understanding of terrestrial arthropods. Arthropleura was the largest land invertebrate ever to exist on Earth. A millipede-like creature reaching lengths of over 2 meters and widths approaching half a meter. This was not a creature you could step over or casually avoid. This was a biological freight train armored with overlapping plates, powered by hundreds of legs, and equipped with defensive capabilities that made it both invulnerable and potentially lethal. The fossils tell an extraordinary story. Arthropleura trackways, fossilized footprints preserved in ancient mudstones, show the exact pattern of its movement. Dozens of legs working in metachronal waves, each leg stepping in sequence like dominoes falling, creating continuous forward motion with surprising efficiency. The width of these trackways confirms the enormous girth of the animal, while their depth indicates substantial weight. Estimates range from 50 to several hundred pounds depending on the species and individual size. This wasn't a delicate creature picking its way through vegetation. This was a bulldozer with legs. Its body plan was simultaneously simple and perfect for its environment. Arthropleura had between 25 and 30 body segments, each protected by 2 pairs of overlapping tergite plates, armored shields made of calcified chitin that provided both protection and structural support. These plates weren't smooth. They had elaborate grooves, ridges, and articulation points that allowed flexibility while maintaining defensive integrity. Modern analysis of these plate structures shows they could withstand significant compressive forces, making Arthropleura effectively immune to most predatory attacks from its era. The question of what Arthropleura ate has generated scientific debate for decades. No preserved gut contents have been found, but multiple lines of evidence suggest herbivory or detritivory. Its mouthparts, reconstructed from rare fossils, lack the crushing power of predatory arthropods. The environment it lived in, dense forests with abundant plant material and decaying vegetation, provided unlimited resources for a large herbivore. Its enormous size required massive caloric intake, and plant matter was the most abundant food source available. Arthropleura was likely the Carboniferous equivalent of a cow, a peaceful giant converting plant biomass into its own body mass with relentless efficiency. But peaceful doesn't mean harmless. Arthropleura's size alone made it dangerous. At over 2 meters long and potentially hundreds of pounds, it had momentum that nothing in the Carboniferous could easily stop. If you encountered one moving through the forest, you'd have two choices: get out of its way or be trampled. Unlike mammals, which can often detect and avoid obstacles, arthropods rely primarily on tactile and chemical senses. Arthropleura likely had poor long-range vision and would not necessarily recognize you as an obstacle until contact occurred. The physics of being trampled by Arthropleura would be brutal. Those armored plates, designed to protect the animal's body, would function as crushing surfaces if they passed over you. The legs, moving in waves, would push and scrape with surprising force. Each individual leg might not be strong, but dozens working together could generate significant pressure. If you fell in front of a moving Arthropleura, it would simply continue forward, treating your body as terrain to cross rather than an obstacle to avoid. More concerning were its defensive capabilities. Modern millipedes, Arthropleura's distant relatives, secrete toxic or noxious chemicals from specialized glands when threatened. Some produce hydrogen cyanide, others benzoquinones. Still others, caustic alkaloids that burn skin on contact. Arthropleura almost certainly possessed similar chemical defenses, scaled up to match its enormous size. Fossil evidence of gland-like structures along its body segments supports this hypothesis. If you accidentally threatened or cornered an Arthropleura, its response would be chemical warfare. Imagine encountering one in a narrow space between trees, a common occurrence in the dense Carboniferous understory. The animal, feeling trapped, would release its defensive secretions. The chemicals would fill the confined space instantly, overwhelming your respiratory system already compromised by oxygen toxicity. Your eyes would burn, your throat would constrict, your skin would blister where the chemicals contacted it. You'd be forced to flee, stumbling blindly through vegetation, while the Arthropleura continued on its path, completely unaffected by the chaos it created. The trackways also revealed that Arthropleura moved in what appear to be well-worn paths through the forests, suggesting habitual routes between feeding areas. These paths would be the easiest routes for you to walk, cleared of dense vegetation, relatively flat, offering better visibility. But they would also be highways for these massive arthropods, and meeting one on its preferred route would force a confrontation you couldn't win. You couldn't fight it. Your attacks would be useless against its armor. You couldn't outrun it, not in your deteriorating physical state. You could only hope to scramble off the path and let it pass, assuming you detected it in time. In the Carboniferous forests, the ground itself was hostile territory, patrolled by armored giants that could crush you accidentally or poison you deliberately. Creatures that had no fear of anything because nothing could threaten them. Arthropleura wasn't hunting you. It didn't need to. It was simply existing in a world where its size and defenses made it invincible, and your presence was utterly irrelevant to its survival. That indifference would be more dangerous than any predator's attention. Pulmonoscorpius, the ambush killer. While you struggled with oxygen poisoning, dodged aerial attacks from Meganeura and avoided being trampled by Arthropleura, another threat would be waiting in the shadows, silent, patient, and equipped with one of nature's most perfected killing tools. Pulmonoscorpius was a giant scorpion reaching lengths of 70 centimeters, making it one of the largest arachnids ever to exist. Unlike the opportunistic hunters above and the indifferent giants below, Pulmonoscorpius was a dedicated ambush predator with venom delivery systems, crushing pedipalps and behavioral patterns refined over millions of years of arthropod evolution. This was a sit-and-wait killer that would detect your approach through ground vibrations, remain completely motionless until you were within striking range, and attack with speed that would make defense impossible. The anatomy of Pulmonoscorpius reveals a creature purpose-built for killing. Its pedipalps, the large pincer-like appendages at the front, were massive structures capable of generating crushing forces. Biomechanical studies of modern scorpions scaled up to Pulmonoscorpius dimensions suggest these pincers could exert pressures exceeding several hundred pounds per square inch. They weren't designed to hold prey. They were designed to immobilize it instantly through sheer mechanical damage. A single strike to a human limb would shatter bones and tear through muscle tissue with catastrophic efficiency. But the pincers were just the setup. The real weapon was the tail, a segmented, armoured structure culminating in a telson, the bulbous venom delivery apparatus equipped with a curved stinger. Modern scorpion venom varies wildly in potency, from mildly irritating to rapidly lethal. Pulmonoscorpius venom composition cannot be directly determined from fossils, but we can make educated inferences based on its size, lifestyle, and modern scorpion biology. Large scorpions typically invest in powerful venom because they can afford the metabolic cost of producing complex toxins. As an ambush predator, Pulmonoscorpius would need venom that acted quickly to prevent prey from escaping or fighting back effectively. The likely venom profile would include neurotoxins targeting sodium channels in nerve cells, causing paralysis and respiratory failure, along with cytotoxins breaking down tissue at the injection site. The volume delivered through a stinger this size would be substantial, perhaps several milliliters compared to the tiny doses from modern scorpions. Even if the venom was relatively mild by weight, the sheer quantity would overwhelm your system. Within minutes of envenomation, you'd experience excruciating pain radiating from the sting site, followed by numbness, muscle spasms, difficulty breathing, and cardiovascular stress as the toxins spread through your bloodstream. Pulmonoscorpius hunting behavior would mirror modern scorpion strategies, scaled up for its massive size. It would hide beneath fallen logs, inside hollow tree bases, or buried partially in leaf litter, with only its eyes exposed. Scorpions have highly sensitive sensory organs called pectines on their undersides, comb-like structures that detect ground vibrations and chemical signals. Pulmonoscorpius would feel your footsteps approaching from meters away, would process this information, and would make the decision to attack or remain hidden based on the vibration patterns. If you appeared to be vulnerable, moving slowly due to oxygen toxicity, perhaps wounded from earlier encounters, certainly unfamiliar with proper scorpion avoidance behavior, Pulmonoscorpius would attack. The strike would be explosive. Modern scorpions can move their tails at speeds exceeding 3 meters per second. A creature the size of Pulmonoscorpius, with longer tail segments and more powerful muscles, would strike even faster. You wouldn't see it coming. You'd feel the impact, pincers clamping onto your ankle or leg, crushing with hydraulic force, followed immediately by the stabbing sensation of the stinger penetrating flesh and pumping venom deep into your tissues. The aftermath would be a race against time your body couldn't win. The venom would begin destroying cells at the injection site, creating a spreading zone of necrotic tissue. Simultaneously, neurotoxins would be traveling through your lymphatic and circulatory systems toward your central nervous system. Your already compromised respiratory function, damaged by hours of hyperoxic exposure, would deteriorate further as the neurotoxins interfered with nerve signals, controlling your diaphragm and intercostal muscles. You'd gasp for air that was simultaneously too oxygen-rich and somehow insufficient as your body's ability to process it collapsed. Even if the venom wasn't immediately lethal, the mechanical damage from the initial attack would be crippling. A crushed ankle or leg would make walking impossible. You'd be immobilized in a forest filled with predators and hazards, unable to flee or defend yourself effectively. The wound would attract other arthropods, scavengers, opportunistic predators, parasites, all drawn by chemical signals indicating injured prey. In the Carboniferous ecosystem, weakness was a death sentence. The fossil record shows Pulmonoscorpius was geographically widespread across the Carboniferous forests of what is now Scotland and elsewhere in Europe and North America. This wasn't a rare creature confined to specific microhabitats. It was a successful, abundant predator that occupied diverse forest environments. Wherever you walked in these forests, you'd be entering Pulmonoscorpius territory, crossing ground where multiple individuals might be hiding within meters of your path. The probability of avoiding them all for 24 hours would be essentially zero. Modern scorpions are most active at night, hunting under cover of darkness, when their prey is less alert, and when cooler temperatures reduce their own metabolic demands. Pulmonoscorpius likely followed similar patterns. As the Carboniferous day faded and darkness fell beneath the dense canopy, these giant arachnids would emerge from hiding, moving through the forest with surprising stealth for their size. Your deteriorating condition, vision compromised, lungs failing, body weakened, would make nighttime movement suicidal. But staying in one place would simply make you an easier target for creatures evolved to detect motionless prey through vibration and chemical signals. The terror of Pulmonoscorpius wasn't its size or its venom alone. It was the combination of ambush tactics, overwhelming initial damage, and the certainty that in a forest filled with these predators, you'd eventually place your foot or hand within striking range. There would be no warning, no chance to avoid the attack, and no realistic possibility of surviving the consequences. The Lycopsid Labyrinth. The trees surrounding you in the Carboniferous forests wouldn't offer shelter. They'd create a vertical prison that would disorient, exhaust, and ultimately trap you in ways no modern forest could. These weren't trees in any sense you'd recognize. Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, the dominant Lycopside scale trees of the period, shot upward in branchless columns 30 to 40 meters tall, their trunks covered in diamond-shaped leaf scars rather than bark, their canopies forming dense mats far above, where sunlight never penetrated to the forest floor. These giants weren't built from solid wood. They were hollow tubes supported by soft inner tissues and thin outer shells, growing at impossible speeds through evolutionary shortcuts that made them simultaneously the most successful and most fragile trees Earth has ever produced. Walking through a Carboniferous Lycopside forest would feel like moving through an architectural nightmare designed by someone who fundamentally misunderstood what forests should be. The trunks stood so close together that navigation became a constant zigzag between obstacles. Their surfaces weren't rough bark offering handholds. They were smooth, hard, and marked with those distinctive diamond patterns where leaves once attached before dropping off. You couldn't climb them even if you tried. The first branches appeared 20 to 30 meters up, far beyond any human climbing ability. And even those branches weren't the spreading limbs of modern trees, but rather sparse, awkward protrusions supporting the spore-bearing cones at the crown. The ground beneath these trees would be treacherous in ways modern forests never achieve. Lycopside roots, technically modified underground stems called stigmarian systems, spread horizontally through the waterlogged soil in massive networks. These structures weren't deep anchoring roots like modern trees use. They were shallow, wide-spreading system designed to stabilize trees in soft, swampy sediments. Where they emerged from the ground, they created trip hazards everywhere. The soil itself would be saturated, soft, and unstable. a mixture of water, decaying plant matter, and bacterial mats that would suck at your feet with every step. Fallen lycopside trunks would litter the forest floor in various stages of decay. Because these trees lacked true wood, when they fell, which happened frequently given their hollow construction and shallow roots, they didn't create solid logs. Instead, they collapsed into fragmenting sections that decomposed rapidly in the humid environment. These fallen trunks would be slippery, unstable, and often hollow, creating pitfalls where your foot might punch through rotting tissue and trap you in decaying plant matter. The smell would be overwhelming, a combination of stagnant water, anaerobic decay, and the organic compounds being released as bacteria slowly broke down cellulose and lignin. The canopy structure created perpetual twilight at ground level. Lycopside crowns formed dense, overlapping mats that blocked most sunlight from reaching below. Modern forests have gaps in their canopies where light penetrates, creating a dynamic light environment. Carboniferous lycopside forests had no such variation. The light that did filter through was dim, diffuse, and greenish. Photons that had scattered through multiple layers of primitive leaves and moist air. Your eyes, already damaged from oxygen toxicity, would struggle to adapt to these low light conditions. Depth perception would become unreliable. Shadows would merge into impenetrable darkness. You'd be functionally navigating blind through an obstacle course of trunks, roots, fallen debris, and hidden hazards. Navigation would be effectively impossible. Modern forests have landmarks, distinctive trees, rock formations, changes in elevation, clearings. Lycopside forests were remarkably uniform. The trees looked identical, grew in similar patterns, and created a maze-like environment without clear sightlines or reference points. Walk 20 meters in any direction, and you'd lose track of where you'd been. The sun wouldn't help. The dense canopy blocked it completely. There were no stars visible at night beneath the overlapping crowns. You'd wander in circles, exhausting yourself while remaining in essentially the same location. The forest floor would be a biological active zone unlike anything in modern ecosystems. Without flowering plants or grasses, the ground was covered in primitive mosses, ferns, and horsetails, growing in dense, tangled mats. These plants grew directly on top of the stigmarian root systems, creating an uneven surface that concealed the actual ground beneath. Step on what looked like solid moss, and your foot might sink knee-deep into waterlogged soil or become entangled in root networks. Each step would require careful testing, slowing your movement to a crawl while predators and hazards closed in from all directions. The lycopsides themselves posed direct dangers beyond just being obstacles. These trees were structurally unstable by design. Fast growth and hollow construction meant they fell frequently, especially during storms or when root systems became waterlogged. A falling lycopside trunk 40 meters tall and weighing several tons would give minimal warning. Perhaps a creaking sound as tissues began tearing, then a rushing noise as it descended. There would be no time to react. The impact would be instantly fatal, crushing anything beneath it. In a forest where trees fell constantly and you couldn't see the canopy through the gloom, every moment would carry the risk of sudden death from above. The psychological effect of being trapped in this environment would compound all the physical dangers. Humans are adapted to open environments with sightlines, clear sky views, and navigable terrain. The lycopside forest would violate every spatial instinct you possess. The claustrophobia of being surrounded by identical trunks in perpetual twilight, unable to climb or see distances, without landmarks or escape routes, would trigger intense anxiety and panic. Poor decisions made under stress, running blindly, attempting to climb, trying to force passage through dense vegetation, would lead to injuries and further exhaustion. The lycopside forest wasn't a habitat. It was a biological machine optimized for rapid carbon sequestration and spore production in a high oxygen world. And that machine had no accommodation for mobile, air-breathing vertebrates. Every feature that made these forests successful, fast growth, dense spacing, shallow roots, waterlogged soils, made them lethal to anything trying to move through them. You wouldn't find shelter here. You'd find a maze with no exit, where every step drained your energy, every breath damaged your lungs, and every minute brought you closer to collapse while predators tracked your increasingly desperate movements through the darkness. The fungi apocalypse. While you struggled through the suffocating Lycopsiad maze, another threat would be working its way into your body, something you couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't escape. The Carboniferous period represents one of the most significant chapters in fungal evolution, a time when fungi were exploding in diversity and developing decomposition strategies that would eventually allow them to break down lignin and cellulose. But in the early to mid-Carboniferous, this process was still inefficient, creating unprecedented accumulations of dead plant matter and forcing fungi to explore every possible substrate for nutrients, including any living tissue that showed signs of weakness or damage. You, wounded and immunocompromised, would be exactly the kind of novel food source these opportunistic decomposers would colonize with devastating efficiency. The sheer biomass of fungi in Carboniferous forests would dwarf anything in modern ecosystems. Fossil evidence from coal deposits shows fungal hyphae, the thread-like structures that make up fungal bodies, penetrating every layer of preserved plant tissue. Some coal seams are essentially fossilized fungal mats mixed with partially decomposed plant material. The air would be thick with fungal spores, billions of microscopic particles drifting through the humid atmosphere, settling on every surface and waiting for suitable conditions to germinate. Every breath you took would introduce thousands of these spores into your respiratory system. Modern humans have immune systems specifically adapted to handle fungal exposure. We're constantly breathing spores, and our bodies efficiently identify and eliminate them before they can establish infections. But your immune system would already be failing under the compound stresses of oxygen toxicity, physical injuries, and physiological breakdown. Your lungs filling with fluid from pulmonary edema would provide perfect growth conditions, warm, moist tissue with compromised defensive barriers. Fungal spores landing in your airways would germinate within hours, sending hyphae into your lung tissue and beginning the process of colonization. The fungal species present in the Carboniferous were taxonomically different from modern forms, but their basic biology would be similar. Once established, fungal hyphae grow by releasing enzymes that break down organic matter, then absorbing the resulting nutrients. In your lungs, these enzymes would begin digesting your own tissues. The infection would spread rapidly through the damaged alveoli, creating expanding zones of necrotic tissue. Your body would mount inflammatory responses, flooding the infected areas with immune cells, but these responses would be ineffective against the sheer mass of fungal growth in your compromised tissues. The symptoms would be brutal. Coughing would intensify as your body tried to expel the fungal material, but the hyphae would be anchored in your tissue, impossible to clear. You'd cough up blood mixed with mucus and fragments of fungal growth, dark material with stringy textures unlike any modern infection. Breathing would become increasingly painful as the infection spread, and inflammatory responses caused tissues to swell. Each breath would feel like inhaling broken glass as damaged airways struggled to move air through infected passages. External wounds would face similar colonization. Any break in your skin, bite marks from meganeura, lacerations from falls, abrasions from moving through vegetation would be exposed to the spore-laden air. Fungal infections of open wounds would begin at the margins, where tissue damage compromised cellular defenses. The hyphae would penetrate into deeper tissues, following blood vessels and muscle fibers, spreading the infection beneath apparently healthy skin. The infected areas would become discolored, swollen, and eventually necrotic as fungal enzymes destroyed structural proteins. What makes fungal infections particularly insidious is their progressive nature. Unlike bacterial infections that might stabilize or overwhelm quickly, fungal infections expand steadily, converting living tissue into fungal biomass at rates determined by environmental conditions. In the warm, humid, carboniferous environment with abundant nutrients available, growth rates would be optimal. An infection established in hour 6 would be visibly worse by hour 12 and catastrophic by hour 24. The fossil record provides evidence of fungal pathogenicity in Carboniferous organisms. Some preserved arthropod specimens show fungal hyphae penetrating their exoskeletons, suggesting that even armoured creatures weren't immune to infection. Plant fossils frequently show internal fungal colonisation, with hyphae networks spreading through vascular tissues. These ancient fungi were aggressive opportunists, and they would recognise your body as an unprecedented food source. Warm-blooded, protein-rich, and lacking the specific defensive compounds that Carboniferous organisms had evolved to produce. Your deteriorating physical condition would accelerate fungal establishment. As oxygen toxicity progressed and your tissues accumulated damage from free radicals, cell membranes would become more permeable. This would make it easier for fungal enzymes to penetrate cellular barriers and for hyphae to physically push through tissues. Your immune system, overwhelmed by multiple threats and operating in a hyperoxic environment it wasn't designed for, would fail to mount effective antifungal responses. You'd essentially be a mobile substrate for decomposition, being colonized while still alive. The psychological horror would be watching your body being taken over by something you couldn't control. You'd see the discoloration spreading from wounds. You'd feel the wet, congested sensation in your lungs as fungal growth obstructed airways. You'd taste the sweet, musty flavour that indicates fungal metabolites in your respiratory tract. Modern antifungal medications wouldn't exist for another 300 million years. There would be no treatment, no way to slow the process, nothing to do but experience your body becoming an ecosystem for organisms that saw you as food rather than as a living being. The fungal threat illustrates a fundamental principle of survival in deep time. Your body is adapted for modern microbial environments where you've co-evolved with specific pathogens and developed defences against them. In the Carboniferous, you'd encounter fungal lineages with completely different enzymatic capabilities, attack strategies, and growth patterns. Your immune system wouldn't recognise them properly, wouldn't deploy appropriate defences, and would fail to contain infections that would be trivial for Carboniferous organisms to resist. You'd be immunologically naive in the most literal sense, a creature from the future completely vulnerable to pathogens from the past. The predatory coalescence. By hour 12, if you'd somehow survived the oxygen toxicity, avoided being killed by Meganeura or Pulmonoscorpius, navigated the Lycopside maze without being crushed, and resisted the initial stages of fungal colonization, you'd face a threat more insidious than any individual predator: the collective attention of an ecosystem that had identified you as vulnerable prey. The Carboniferous forest operated under predatory dynamics completely unlike modern environments. With oxygen levels supporting gigantism in arthropods and enabling unprecedented mobility and sensory capabilities, the forest functioned as integrated hunting grounds where distress signals, chemical, acoustic, visual, would draw multiple predator species to the same target in what could be called predatory coalescence. The process would begin with your first injury. Blood contains hundreds of volatile organic compounds, molecules that evaporate and diffuse through the air, creating chemical signatures detectable by arthropod sensory systems. Meganeura, with its advanced compound eyes and chemosensory organs, would detect blood scent from distances exceeding 100 meters. But Meganeura wouldn't be alone. Every predatory and scavenging arthropod within range would respond to the same signals. Smaller proto-dragonflies, predatory beetles, centipedes, opportunistic millipedes, hunting spiders, and species whose fossils haven't been preserved, but whose ecological roles can be inferred from modern arthropod communities. The acoustic environment would betray you further. Your movements through the forest, crashing through vegetation, splashing through waterlogged soil, coughing from lung damage, would generate vibrations travelling through the substrate. Arthropods are extraordinarily sensitive to vibrations. Scorpions detect footsteps through ground vibrations. Spiders sense prey through web vibrations. Centipedes hunt using tactile and vibrational cues. In the Carboniferous, with massive arthropods possessing proportionally larger sensory organs, vibration detection would be even more acute. Every step would announce your location to predators within a widening radius. Chemical distress signals would compound the problem. Your body, under extreme physiological stress, would be releasing stress hormones, metabolic byproducts, and immune signaling molecules through your skin and breath. Many of these compounds would be novel to Carboniferous arthropods. You're a mammalian form 300 million years before mammals. But novelty doesn't mean undetectable. Arthropod chemoreception works by detecting molecular shapes and functional groups. Your stress chemicals would trigger responses in predatory arthropods tuned to seek out compromised prey. The mathematical reality of predator attraction follows basic diffusion principles. A chemical signal spreads outward from the source in an expanding sphere, diluting with distance but remaining detectable far beyond visual range. In still air, scent molecules can travel hundreds of meters before concentrations drop below detection thresholds. In the Carboniferous forests, with minimal air movement beneath the canopy, scent trails would persist for extended periods, creating lasting markers of your passage. Predators encountering your trail would follow it toward the source, toward you. This creates a feedback loop where the presence of one predator attracts others. A Meganeura attacking you would create additional blood scent and movement vibrations. Pulmonoscorpius, emerging from hiding to investigate, would add its own chemical signatures as it moved. Arthropleura, though not predatory, might lumber toward the disturbance out of curiosity or territorial behavior, creating more vibrations. The forest would begin converging on your location, not through coordinated pack hunting. Arthropods don't have the neural architecture for that, but through independent responses to overlapping signals. The fossil record provides indirect evidence for this kind of predatory coalescence. Certain Carboniferous deposit sites show concentrations of predatory arthropod fossils around what appear to be kill sites, areas where prey died and attracted multiple scavengers. While these fossils represent post-mortem scavenging, they demonstrate that arthropod predators responded collectively to food sources. A living, bleeding human would trigger similar responses, but the organisms arriving wouldn't wait politely. They'd be trying to secure the resource before competitors arrived. Your defensive options would be essentially non-existent. You couldn't fight multiple giant arthropods simultaneously. Even if you killed one, unlikely given your condition and their armor, others would continue attacking. Running would be impossible in the tangled forest environment while your legs failed from oxygen toxicity and injuries. Climbing was ruled out by the branchless lycopside trunks. Hiding would be futile when predators tracked you through multiple sensory channels simultaneously. The timing would accelerate as your condition worsened. Initial predator encounters might be sporadic, one Meganeura attack, one near miss with Pulmonoscorpius. But as injuries accumulated and your movements became more erratic from exhaustion and oxygen deprivation, the rate of encounters would increase. The chemical trail you left would grow stronger. The sounds of your distress would carry farther. The visual cues of your presence, disturbed vegetation, blood trails, movement patterns, would become more obvious to hunting arthropods. Modern ecosystems have predator satiation, the principle that predators can only kill and consume so much prey, limiting their impact. Carboniferous arthropods operated under different constraints. Most were opportunistic and could exploit food sources beyond their immediate needs, either consuming them partially or simply killing them and moving on. An arthropod that couldn't physically consume you might still attack out of predatory instinct or territorial defense. The aggregation of predators around your location would create a feeding frenzy effect, even though you represented a single food source. The psychological dimension would be the final breaking point. Knowing that every sound in the darkness might be another predator approaching, that every shadow could hide another threat, that your own body is betraying your location through signals you can't control. This would trigger primal panic responses. Humans under extreme stress make poor decisions, freezing when movement is needed, running when stillness would help, fighting when withdrawal would work. Each poor decision would generate more signals, attracting more predators, creating a death spiral of escalating threat and deteriorating judgment. By midday in the Carboniferous forests, you wouldn't be navigating an environment. You'd be at the center of a closing net of predatory attention, where every organism capable of detecting your presence would be converging on your location through independent responses to the same multitude of signals. The forest itself would become a trap with walls made of chitin and venom, tightening around you with the mathematical inevitability of diffusion gradients and predatory behavior patterns that had been refined over hundreds of millions of years of arthropod evolution. The thermal regulation catastrophe. As the Carboniferous day progressed and you accumulated injuries, infections, and oxygen damage, another physiological crisis would be reaching critical levels, one that would demonstrate just how specifically adapted human biology is to modern conditions. Thermoregulation, the process of maintaining stable body temperature, requires precise coordination of metabolic heat production, evaporative cooling, circulatory adjustments, and behavioral modifications. Every component of this system would be failing in the Carboniferous environment, creating a cascade of problems that would push your body toward fatal heat stroke even as you simultaneously struggled with respiratory failure and systemic infections. Human thermoregulation evolved for modern atmospheric conditions and specific temperature ranges. Our bodies generate heat through metabolism, chemical reactions in cells that release energy, much of which becomes thermal energy. At rest, a human produces roughly 100 watts of heat, equivalent to a bright light bulb. This heat must be dissipated continuously to prevent core temperature from rising. Modern humans accomplish this through several mechanisms: radiation of infrared energy from skin, convection as air moves across the body, conduction to cooler surfaces, and primarily through evaporative cooling, sweating. The Carboniferous atmosphere would sabotage every cooling mechanism. The hyperoxic air would accelerate your metabolic rate as cellular respiration became more efficient at extracting energy from glucose. This sounds positive, but efficiency in energy extraction means more heat production. Your basal metabolic rate might increase 20 to 30% simply from the oxygen concentration, adding another 20 to 30 watts of heat that must be dissipated. Combined with the physical exertion of moving through difficult terrain while injured, your heat production could double or triple. Meanwhile, your ability to shed this heat would be catastrophically impaired. The Carboniferous tropical lowlands where lycopside forests grew had temperatures likely ranging from 25 to 35 degrees Celsius, warm enough that radiation and convection would be minimal. When environmental temperature approaches body temperature, these passive cooling methods become ineffective. Your body can't radiate heat to air that's nearly as warm as you are. Convection requires temperature differentials to work. you'd be relying almost entirely on evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling requires sweat to evaporate from skin surfaces, carrying heat energy away as water molecules transition from liquid to gas. This process is exquisitely sensitive to humidity. In dry conditions, sweat evaporates rapidly, providing efficient cooling. As humidity rises, evaporation rates plummet. At 100% humidity, saturation, evaporation essentially stops. Water cannot evaporate into air that's already holding maximum moisture. The Carboniferous forest environment, with its waterlogged soils, dense vegetation, and lack of air circulation beneath the canopy, would maintain humidity levels near saturation constantly. Your sweat glands would continue producing sweat in response to rising core temperature, but that sweat wouldn't evaporate. It would simply accumulate on your skin, drip off, and be wasted. You'd be losing fluid. Dehydration would accelerate without gaining any cooling benefit. This is the mechanism behind heat stroke in high humidity environments. The body's primary cooling system fails while heat production continues, causing core temperature to rise uncontrollably. The cardiovascular impacts would compound rapidly. As core temperature rises, your body attempts compensatory measures, dilating blood vessels near the skin to increase heat radiation, increasing heart rate to move blood faster to cooling surfaces, and redirecting blood flow from internal organs to skin. These responses work in moderate heat stress, but become counterproductive in extreme conditions. Your heart, already stressed by the hyperoxic environment and the oxygen toxicity damaging cardiac tissues, would be racing at elevated rates for hours. Heart rates above 120 beats per minute, sustained indefinitely, lead to cardiac exhaustion. Blood pressure would destabilize. The combination of peripheral vasodilation, dehydration from sweating, and blood loss from injuries would reduce effective circulating volume. Your blood pressure would drop, compromising oxygen delivery to vital organs despite the hyperoxic atmosphere. The brain is particularly sensitive to perfusion pressure. As blood pressure dropped, you'd experience dizziness, confusion, and altered consciousness. Symptoms of inadequate cerebral blood flow, even while surrounded by oxygen-rich air. The timeline of heat stroke progression is well documented in modern medicine and would accelerate in Carboniferous conditions. Core temperature rising above 38 degrees Celsius triggers mild heat exhaustion, weakness, nausea, headache. Above 39 degrees, heat exhaustion becomes severe. Confusion, rapid heartbeat, potential loss of consciousness. Above 40 degrees, you enter heat stroke territory, multi-organ failure, seizures, coma, death. Without intervention, cooling measures, fluid replacement, rest, progression through these stages takes mere hours. The neurological effects would be among the first noticeable failures. The human brain is extremely temperature sensitive. Neurons function optimally in a narrow range around 37 degrees Celsius. As temperature rises, enzymatic reactions accelerate beyond optimal rates, neurotransmitter dynamics shift, and cellular stress responses activate. You'd experience cognitive decline, difficulty thinking clearly, impaired decision-making, memory problems, spatial disorientation. These deficits would be fatal in an environment requiring constant vigilance and rapid responses to threats. Heat stroke also triggers systemic inflammatory responses similar to sepsis. Your immune system, detecting cellular damage from heat stress, would release inflammatory cytokines that cause fever, actively raising core temperature in response to heat damage. This paradoxical response evolved to fight infections, but became catastrophic during heat stroke. Your body would be fighting against its own survival, generating additional heat through inflammatory processes while cooling systems failed. The combination of heat stroke and oxygen toxicity would create synergistic damage. High temperatures increase the rate of free radical production from the hyperoxic environment, accelerating oxidative stress. damaged proteins from heat denature faster, creating more cellular debris that triggers more inflammation. Your lungs, already compromised by pulmonary edema and fungal infections, would have reduced capacity just when your body needed maximum respiratory function to support the elevated metabolic rate of heat stress. By hour 18, assuming you'd survived that long, you'd be in multi-system failure driven primarily by thermal dysregulation. Your core temperature might reach 41 or 42 degrees Celsius, levels where proteins begin denaturing, where cellular machinery breaks down, where brain cells start dying. You'd be delirious, unable to move effectively, possibly unconscious. Your body would be cooking itself from the inside while the Carboniferous forest remained obliviously humid, warm, and absolutely indifferent to your thermal emergency. The air that felt uncomfortably warm at hour 1 would be killing you through the simple physics of heat transfer and the biological reality that human thermoregulation requires specific environmental conditions that the Carboniferous could never provide. The wildfire equation. As you entered the final hours of your Carboniferous ordeal, weakened by every threat the forest had thrown at you, the ecosystem itself would prepare to deliver its most catastrophic blow, one that wouldn't target you specifically, but would consume everything in its path, with physics so brutal that survival would be mathematically impossible. The Carboniferous forests were powder kegs waiting for ignition, environments where atmospheric conditions, plant biology, and accumulated fuel loads created fire behaviour unlike anything modern humans have witnessed. These weren't ordinary wildfires, they were oxygen-fueled infernos that burned hotter, spread faster, and released energy at scales that would turn entire forest regions into crematoriums within minutes of ignition. The fundamental equation governing fire behaviour is simple. Combustion requires fuel, oxygen, and an ignition source. The Carboniferous provided all three in unprecedented quantities. The fuel load was staggering. Centuries of accumulated plant material that fungi couldn't efficiently decompose created layers of dead vegetation meters deep. Fallen lycopside trunks, shed leaves, broken branches, and carpets of dead moss formed continuous fuel beds extending across vast areas. Modern fire ecologists measure fuel loads in tons per hectare. Carboniferous fuel loads would have exceeded any modern forest by factors of 10 or more. The oxygen concentration turned this fuel into explosive material. Modern fires burn in 21% oxygen. Combustion efficiency increases linearly with oxygen availability. At 35% oxygen, chemical reaction rates accelerate dramatically. Ignition temperatures drop. Materials that won't burn in modern conditions ignite readily. Flame temperatures rise by hundreds of degrees. Most critically, flame spread rates increase exponentially. A fire that advances at 1 metre per minute in modern conditions might advance at 5 to 10 metres per minute in the Carboniferous atmosphere. Ignition sources were everywhere. Lightning strikes during Carboniferous thunderstorms would have been common. The same humid conditions that tortured you with heat stress would generate massive convective storms with intense electrical activity. A single lightning bolt striking a dead lycopside trunk would ignite it instantly. Spontaneous combustion becomes probable in hyperoxic conditions. Decomposing plant material generates heat through bacterial metabolism. In thick fuel beds with poor heat dissipation, temperatures can build to ignition points. Once ignited, Carboniferous fires would behave like no modern wildfire. The high oxygen content would support complete combustion, nearly every carbon atom in the fuel converting to carbon dioxide and releasing maximum energy. The heat release rates would be catastrophic. Fire spread mechanisms would be similarly amplified. Flames would be hotter and larger, reaching farther to ignite new fuel. Radiant heat from these intense flames would preheat fuel beds at greater distances, accelerating ignition. Most dangerously, the fires would generate massive convection columns, superheated air rising rapidly and creating powerful updrafts that would loft burning embers kilometres ahead of the main fire front. The physics of these convection columns would create fire behaviour that modern terminology barely describes. Hot air rising from the fire would draw in surrounding air at ground level, the familiar fire draft effect. In hyperoxic conditions with extreme heat release, these drafts would become winds, accelerating to speeds exceeding 50 kilometres per hour. These winds would fan the flames, increasing combustion rates further in a positive feedback loop. The convection column itself would reach altitudes of several kilometres, creating its own weather system complete with fire-generated lightning. Your position in the forest when ignition occurred would be largely irrelevant. Carboniferous fires wouldn't give you time to react or routes to escape. The initial ignition might occur kilometres away, invisible through dense vegetation. Your first warning would be a distant roar, the sound of millions of cubic metres of air being drawn into the combustion zone. Then you'd smell it, burning like lycopside tissue, releasing compounds that haven't existed on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. The temperature would rise noticeably minutes before flames arrived. Radiant heat from the approaching fire front would travel at the speed of light, warming everything in its path. The air temperature around you might climb from 30 to 50 degrees Celsius in seconds. You'd feel your skin heating, your exposed surfaces becoming uncomfortably warm, then painful. This radiant preheating is how fires kill before flames arrive, by raising ambient temperatures to levels incompatible with life. When the fire front reached your location, you'd have perhaps 30 seconds of awareness before death. The wall of flames would be 5 to 10 metres high, advancing at speeds exceeding your maximum running capability. The flames wouldn't need to touch you directly. The air temperature within 50 metres of the fire front would exceed 300 degrees Celsius. Your respiratory tract would suffer catastrophic damage with the first breath of superheated air. Your skin would begin cooking, proteins denaturing, cell structures breaking down in seconds. The fire would pass over your location in minutes, consuming centuries of accumulated fuel. Your body would be another fuel source, the organic compounds in your tissues adding energy to the inferno. The high oxygen content would ensure complete combustion. Your remains would be ash and carbonized fragments. The lycopside forest that had been your prison would become your crematorium, transformed into a moonscape where nothing survived the oxygen-fueled apocalypse. The aquatic death trap. If by some miracle you'd managed to detect an approaching fire early enough to run, your instincts would scream at you to find water, the universal refuge from flames. The Carboniferous forests were saturated with aquatic environments, rivers, streams, ponds, lakes, and vast swamps where lycopside forests transitioned to open water. Surely submerging yourself would provide protection from the inferno. This intuition, correct in modern conditions, would lead you directly into another death trap, because Carboniferous aquatic environments were as hostile as the terrestrial forests, perhaps more so. The water itself would be your first problem. Modern freshwater systems are relatively neutral in pH, well oxygenated, and colonized by microbiomes that evolved alongside terrestrial vertebrates. Carboniferous water bodies were profoundly different. The constant input of organic material from the forests created water chemistry dominated by decay products. Dissolved organic carbon would be present at concentrations orders of magnitude higher than modern freshwater. The water would be dark brown or black, stained by tannins and humic acids, leaching from decomposing plant matter. Oxygen levels in this water would be paradoxically low despite the hyperoxic atmosphere. The same bacterial decomposition that produced organic acids consumed dissolved oxygen voraciously. Deep water or still pools would be anoxic. completely devoid of oxygen below the surface layer. Submerging yourself in anoxic water while already suffering respiratory distress would be immediately fatal. You'd be holding your breath in water that, even if you inhaled it, would provide no oxygen to your tissues. The microbial load would be staggering. Carboniferous water bodies were bacterial soups containing trillions of microorganisms per milliliter. Without adaptive immune systems that recognize these specific pathogens, your body would be defenseless. Simply getting this water in your mouth, nose, or eyes would introduce massive bacterial contamination. Any open wound submerged in this water would become severely infected within minutes. But the real threats were the predators. Carboniferous aquatic environments supported diverse and dangerous fauna. The most notorious were the early sharks, primitive species like Stethecanthus and Orthocanthus. These weren't sleek predators of modern oceans, but experimental designs with bizarre morphologies. Yet their teeth were real. Their predatory instincts were honed by millions of years of evolution, and they would detect you instantly upon entering their territory. Shark electroreception would betray you. Sharks possess specialized organs called ampullae of Lorenzini that detect electrical fields generated by muscle contractions and neural activity in prey. Your heart beating, your muscles moving, your neurons firing, all would generate weak electrical fields that would shine like beacons to any shark within 100 meters. In murky, tannin-stained water, where vision was useless, electroreception would guide them directly to you with unerring accuracy. The bite force of Carboniferous sharks remains speculative, but their tooth morphology provides clues. Many species had multi-cusped teeth designed for gripping and tearing. These teeth would lock into flesh, and the shark would thrash, a technique called death roll that modern sharks still employ to tear chunks from prey too large to swallow whole. A bite to your leg or arm would remove significant tissue, cause massive bleeding, and likely damage major blood vessels or bones. Other aquatic predators would join the frenzy. Giant eurypterids, the sea scorpions that occasionally ventured into fresh water, would detect blood and disturbance. These arthropods, reaching lengths over 2 meters in some species, had powerful pincers and predatory instincts refined over eons. A eurypterid latching onto your torso with its pedipalps would drag you beneath the surface with strength you couldn't overcome. The physical stress of swimming would be fatal in your condition. Your lungs, filled with fluid and infected with fungi, could barely support breathing on land. Swimming requires elevated respiratory rate and oxygen delivery to muscles doing intense work. You'd be gasping, possibly aspirating the contaminated water itself. Your core temperature, already dangerously elevated from heat stroke, wouldn't decrease in warm Carboniferous water. You'd gain no cooling relief while expending energy you didn't have. The water would also trap you. Aquatic vegetation in Carboniferous swamps was dense. Primitive water plants formed tangled masses below the surface. Your clothes would snag on submerged stems and roots. Your weakened muscles couldn't generate force needed to tear free. Panic would set in as you realized you were entangled, unable to reach the surface, drowning in slow motion while your lungs screamed for air. Perhaps worst of all, the water wouldn't save you from fire. Large wildfires generate such intense radiant heat that they can boil lakes and rivers. The superheated air above water would raise surface temperatures to scalding levels. You'd face an impossible choice: remain submerged in anoxic, predator-filled water until your breath ran out, or surface into air hot enough to burn your lungs. Either way, death would be certain. The nocturnal horror. If somehow, through impossible luck and endurance far beyond human capability, you survived to sunset in the Carboniferous forests, you'd face a transformation that would make the daylight horrors seem almost manageable. The nocturnal ecosystem was fundamentally different from the diurnal one, populated by creatures and phenomena that operated under entirely different rules. The physics of sound, the behavior patterns of night-hunting arthropods, and the simple fact of total darkness beneath a dense canopy would convert the forest into a sensory nightmare where your primary sense, vision, became useless, while predators adapted to darkness moved with perfect confidence. The onset of darkness would be rapid. Without the extended twilight periods of higher latitudes, tropical Carboniferous regions would experience quick transitions from day to night. The little light that penetrated the lycopside canopy during the day would vanish completely within minutes of sunset. The darkness wouldn't be the gentle dimness of modern forests. It would be absolute blackness, the kind humans never experience except in deep caves. Your pupils would dilate fully, your eyes desperately trying to gather photons that simply weren't there. The darkness would be disorienting at a neurological level. Human spatial awareness depends heavily on visual input. Remove vision, and your brain struggles to construct accurate mental maps of surroundings. You'd experience vertigo, uncertainty about distances and directions, inability to judge whether you were standing on level ground or about to step into a depression. Every movement would become tentative, hands extended forward, feet carefully probing before committing weight. The acoustic environment would transform completely. Diurnal insects would fall silent. In their place, the nocturnal chorus would begin, sounds unlike anything in modern forests. Giant crickets and their relatives would produce calls generated by stridulation, rubbing specialized body parts together to create vibrations. Scaled up to Carboniferous sizes, these calls would be deeper, louder, more resonant. The forest would fill with clicks, chirps, buzzes and hums at frequencies ranging from infrasound to ultrasound, creating an alien soundscape that would disguise the approach of threats. Your own movements would betray you more effectively at night. The leaf litter, waterlogged soil, and tangled vegetation that you struggled through during daylight would become acoustic landmines. Every step would generate sounds: crackling of dry material, squelching of mud, rustling of disturbed plants. These sounds would propagate through substrate and air, detected by every nocturnal predator within range. You'd be unable to move silently even if you understood the need for stealth. The nocturnal hunters would be specifically adapted for these conditions. Pulmonoscorpius would become more active. Scorpions are primarily nocturnal in modern ecosystems, hunting under cover of darkness when prey is less alert. Their sensory systems, pectines detecting ground vibrations, chemoreceptors processing airborne molecules, would work perfectly in total darkness. They wouldn't need to see you. They'd feel your footsteps, smell your stress chemicals, and strike with the same accuracy as in daylight. Other nocturnal arthropods would join the hunt. Giant centipedes, specimens in the Carboniferous reached lengths exceeding 1/2 metre, would emerge from daytime hiding spots to patrol the forest floor. These predators possessed elongated, flexible bodies capable of rapid movement and venomous forcipules, modified legs near the head that injected toxins into prey. Centipede venom delivered in Carboniferous quantities to a human would cause excruciating pain, tissue damage, and potentially systemic effects. The darkness would magnify your existing medical crisis exponentially. You couldn't assess wounds visually. You'd have to explore them by touch, feeling the swelling, the heat of infection, the sticky dampness of continued bleeding. You couldn't see hazards until you physically encountered them: fallen logs, holes in the ground, water obstacles. Navigation would be impossible. You'd have no way to move in any consistent direction. Your deteriorating mental state from oxygen toxicity and heat stroke would worsen dramatically in darkness. Humans are diurnal animals. Our circadian rhythms expect light-dark cycles that reinforce temporal orientation. Trapped in unchanging darkness, unable to see anything, Hearing alien sounds on all sides, your cognitive function would degrade into confusion and possibly hallucinations. The stress of complete sensory deprivation combined with knowledge of imminent death would break down psychological coherence. Sleep would be impossible and suicidal. Your body, pushed beyond all limits, would desperately need rest, but lying down in the Carboniferous forest at night would be effectively suicide. Nocturnal predators would find you immediately. A stationary heat source radiating infrared, generating chemical signals, producing the characteristic sounds of breathing. You couldn't maintain watch while sleeping. You'd be defenseless during unconsciousness. By midnight, your situation would be absolutely hopeless. You'd been dying slowly throughout the day from multiple causes, but the night would accelerate the end. Unable to see, unable to navigate, unable to defend yourself, unable to rest, you'd simply wait in the darkness for whichever threat found you first. The nocturnal Carboniferous forest was the final and perhaps cruelest stage, a reminder that the ancient Earth was designed without any consideration for human survival. The toxic rain. As you entered the final hours before your certain death, the Carboniferous atmosphere would prepare to deliver one more chemical assault, one that wouldn't come from the ground or from predators, but from the sky itself. The same high oxygen levels that had been poisoning you all day would create atmospheric chemistry radically different from modern conditions, producing precipitation that was chemically aggressive, biologically contaminated, and physically dangerous. Carboniferous rain wasn't the relatively neutral water that falls in modern climates. It was a corrosive solution laden with organic acids, dissolved minerals, and reactive compounds. The generation of Carboniferous rain began with fundamental physics of precipitation, but the chemistry diverged immediately from modern processes. Water evaporating from warm swamps and lakes would rise into the atmosphere carrying dissolved organic compounds, the same tannins, humic acids, and decomposition products that stained the water dark brown. This contaminated water vapor would form clouds that were chemically active rather than merely condensed moisture. The clouds themselves would be slightly acidic from dissolved organics even before other processes began modifying their chemistry. The high oxygen concentration would drive atmospheric chemistry in unprecedented directions. Oxygen reacts with various atmospheric compounds under ultraviolet radiation, producing highly reactive species. Ozone formation would occur at much higher rates than modern conditions. Ozone is unstable and reactive, and in the humid tropical atmosphere it would dissolve into cloud droplets, creating solutions of oxidizing agents that would aggressively attack organic materials. The forests themselves would be contributing to rain chemistry through their massive scale. Billions of lycopside trees would be releasing volatile organic compounds, molecules that plants produce as defensive chemicals or metabolic byproducts. In Carboniferous forests with unprecedented plant biomass, VOC concentrations would be far higher. These compounds, dissolved in rainwater, would create complex chemical mixtures, some acidic, some basic, many biologically active or toxic. When rain finally began falling, it would carry this chemical burden downward in droplets that hit your skin with physical force and chemical aggression. The first sensation would be stinging. Your skin, already damaged by heat stress, fungal infections, and various injuries, would have compromised barrier function. The acidic, oxidizing rainwater would penetrate into exposed tissues, causing immediate pain as it contacted nerve endings and damaged barely surviving cells. Your eyes would be particularly vulnerable. Even small amounts of contaminated rainwater entering your eyes would cause severe irritation. The cornea and conjunctiva are delicate tissues optimized for optical clarity, not chemical resistance. The organic acids and oxidizing compounds in the rain would disrupt the tear film, damage epithelial cells, and cause inflammation that would further impair your already compromised vision. Open wounds would become emergency zones. Fungal infections already established in your injuries would be exposed to rainwater carrying different fungal spores and bacterial contaminants washed from the canopy and air. The chemical properties of the rain would alter wound pH, disrupting the local environment and potentially making infections more aggressive. The physical impact of rain hitting open injuries would be painful, each droplet carrying kinetic energy that became sharp stings when concentrated on traumatized tissue. The rain would also create new hazards through its interactions with the environment. The forest floor, already waterlogged, would become even more unstable. Soil structure would break down into thick mud that sucked at your feet, making every step a struggle. The mud would be contaminated with centuries of decomposed matter, bacterial films, and chemical residues. Getting this mud on your skin or in wounds would introduce additional infections. The temperature effects would be complex. Rain would provide evaporative cooling, which might seem beneficial given your heat stroke. However, the cooling would be uneven and uncontrolled. Your core temperature was dangerously elevated. Rapid surface cooling could trigger cardiovascular shock as blood vessels constricted and blood pressure became unstable. Shivering might begin, your body's confused response to conflicting temperature signals. Hypothermia would become a real risk despite the warm environment. Your body's ability to maintain temperature depends on dry insulation from clothing and air layers near skin. Prolonged rain would saturate any clothing, eliminate insulating air spaces, and increase thermal conductivity. Heat loss through wet clothing can be 25 times faster than through dry clothing. Combined with your compromised metabolism and exhausted energy reserves, your core temperature could begin dropping. The psychological impact of cold rain falling in darkness would be devastating. Modern humans associate rain with shelter seeking, drying off, changing clothes, none of which would be possible. You'd simply stand or lie in the rain, getting progressively wetter, colder, and more miserable while your body failed on multiple fronts simultaneously. By the final hours, as rain continued falling through darkness, as your body temperature destabilized, as infections spread unchecked, as predators stalked through the storm, the rain would seem almost like nature itself was trying to wash you away. The Carboniferous rain wasn't trying to kill you specifically. It was simply performing atmospheric processes that had cycled for millions of years. But to your dying body, each drop would be another small cruelty in a day full of catastrophic ones. The spore cloud suffocation. In the waning hours of your Carboniferous death sentence, as multiple organ systems approached total failure and your consciousness fragmented into delirium, the forest would unleash one final atmospheric assault that perfectly encapsulated the alien nature of this ancient world. The spore release event, a synchronized reproductive explosion from billions of lycopside trees, giant ferns, and primitive plants, would transform the air itself into a suffocating biological cloud so dense that breathing became an act of slow drowning in microscopic particles. This wasn't the pollen season as modern humans understand it. This was a coordinated biological event involving quantities of reproductive material measured in tons per square kilometre, creating atmospheric conditions that would overload your respiratory system within minutes and accelerate your death through mechanisms that combine mechanical obstruction, immune system collapse, and chemical irritation into a unified pulmonary catastrophe. Lycopside spore cones positioned at crown tops would split open in coordinated waves, releasing clouds of spores so dense they would be visible as golden brown mist descending through the canopy. Individual spores were microscopic, typically 20 to 100 micrometers in diameter, but their collective mass would darken the air like fog. Each breath you took would introduce millions of these particles into your respiratory tract. Your nose, designed to filter particles above 10 micrometers, would capture some spores in nasal mucus, but the sheer quantity would overwhelm this first line of defense immediately. Within seconds, your nasal passages would feel clogged, packed with spore-laden mucus that you'd reflexively try to expel through sneezing and coughing. The spores that bypass nasal filtration would proceed into your trachea and bronchi. Here, your respiratory tract relies on mucociliary clearance, microscopic cilia beating in coordinated waves to move mucus and trap particles upward for swallowing or expectoration. Under normal conditions, this system efficiently removes inhaled particles, but Carboniferous spore concentrations would exceed its capacity by orders of magnitude. The mucus layer would become so thick with trapped spores that ciliary beating couldn't move it. The accumulating material would begin obstructing airways, reducing airflow and triggering violent coughing as your body desperately tried to clear the obstruction. Deeper in your lungs, spores would reach the bronchioles and alveoli, the delicate structures where gas exchange occurs. These regions lack ciliary clearance mechanisms. They rely on immune cells called alveolar macrophages to engulf and remove particles. A healthy person's macrophages can handle moderate particle exposure, but you were far from healthy. Your immune system was already overwhelmed fighting fungal infections, bacterial contaminations, and tissue damage from oxygen toxicity. The sudden influx of millions of foreign particles would simply exceed your macrophages' processing capacity. Spores would begin accumulating in alveolar spaces, physically blocking gas exchange surfaces. The inflammatory response would be catastrophic. Your immune system, detecting massive quantities of foreign organic material, would trigger systemic inflammation. Immune cells would flood into your lungs, releasing inflammatory mediators, cytokines, histamines, prostaglandins, that cause blood vessels to leak fluid into tissues. This fluid accumulation, combined with the pulmonary edema you were already experiencing from oxygen toxicity, would create a perfect storm of respiratory failure. Your alveoli would be filled with a mixture of fluid, inflammatory cells, fungal hyphae, bacteria, and now billions of plant spores. A biological soup that prevented oxygen from reaching your bloodstream. The chemical composition of the spores would add another dimension of injury. Plant spores are coated with sporopollenin, an extremely tough, chemically resistant material that protects the spore during dispersal and dormancy. Sporopollenin contains various organic compounds, some of which trigger allergic responses in sensitive individuals. Your immune system, never having encountered Carboniferous sporopollenin, would recognize it as foreign and potentially threatening. Allergic type reactions would develop rapidly. Bronchial smooth muscle would constrict, narrowing airways. Mucus production would increase further. Blood vessel permeability would rise, worsening fluid accumulation. You'd essentially be experiencing an extreme allergic reaction overlaid on your existing respiratory crisis. The mechanical effects would become unbearable. Each breath would require enormous effort as you tried to move air through airways clogged with mucus and spores. The work of breathing would skyrocket, respiratory muscles consuming more oxygen than they delivered to the body. This negative energy balance would accelerate your physiological collapse. Your accessory breathing muscles, neck muscles, abdominal muscles, intercostals, would be recruited in increasingly desperate attempts to maintain ventilation. You'd be gasping with your entire torso, mouth gaping, trying to suck air through passages that were increasingly blocked. Your coughing would attract every predator within hearing range. The violent, wet coughs of a respiratory system in failure, sounds unlike normal coughing, more like choking and retching combined, would carry through the forest as obvious distress signals. Nocturnal predators would recognize these sounds as indicators of vulnerable prey. The acoustic signature would draw them from all directions, while you remained helplessly focused on the simple act of trying to breathe. The psychological horror would be profound. Suffocation triggers primal panic responses. The feeling of air hunger is one of the most terrifying sensations humans can experience. Even knowing death was inevitable, your brain would scream commands to breathe, to clear your airways, to escape the suffocating environment. But there would be no escape. The spore cloud would be kilometers wide, released simultaneously across vast areas of forest. You couldn't outrun it, couldn't climb above it, couldn't find clean air anywhere within reach. You'd simply suffocate slowly while your lungs filled with the reproductive products of plants that saw you as nothing more than an obstacle temporarily blocking space that would soon be available for their offspring. The final stages would merge with all your other failing systems into unified collapse. Hypoxia from blocked gas exchange would cause your heart to race faster, trying to deliver what little oxygen remained in your blood to vital organs. But your heart was already exhausted from hours of stress, and this final demand would push it toward arrhythmia and failure. Your brain, starved of oxygen despite being surrounded by hyperoxic air, would experience cascading neuron death. Consciousness would fragment into brief, confused moments, separated by increasing periods of blackout. You might experience hallucinations as dying neurons fired randomly, visions of safety, memories of home, faces of loved ones impossibly distant in both space and time. Your last breaths would be wet, gurgling sounds as fluid and spores filled your airways completely. The diaphragm would continue contracting reflexively even as no air moved, your body executing the mechanics of breathing long after breathing had become impossible. And then finally, the spasms would weaken and stop. Your consciousness would fade permanently into darkness. The spore cloud would continue settling through the night, covering your body in a golden brown shroud, incorporating you into the forest floor where fungi and bacteria would begin the slow process of returning your molecules to the ecosystem. The Carboniferous had killed you not through malice, but through indifference. You were simply an organism in the wrong place, in the wrong time.